This is NASA astronaut Joseph P. Allen, the first and only human to ever wrestle a satellite in orbit. Yeah, you heard that right. Joe wasn't in a gym or a movie stunt. He was actually in the vacuum of outer space, floating above Earth with nothing but a jetpack strapped to his back. Moments before this wild event, Joe also became one of the very few people in history to float completely untethered in space. No ropes, no cords. Just him, his jetpack, and the infinite darkness around him. If you think your job has stressful days, Joe's probably beats it. So what led Joe to such a dramatic and historic moment? Why was an astronaut literally grabbing hold of a satellite like a space cowboy? The answer lies in a mission so daring and improbable that it sounds like science fiction. Joe and his fellow crewmates were part of a space rescue operation, something that NASA actually used to attempt back in the 1980s. It wasn't just talk. It was real, hands-on, high-risk space problem-solving. These types of missions aren't even possible today. The hardware, procedures, and audacity have faded into history. Back in the early days of human spaceflight, there was this unique feeling in the air, a sense that NASA could accomplish just about anything. It was a time when space wasn't just about satellites and experiments, it was about pushing the limits of what humans could do. One of the boldest examples of this spirit was the story of the twin satellite rescue mission, which began on a chilly February day in 1984. It was NASA's 10th shuttle flight and the debut of a technology that was straight out of a sci-fi movie. That mission marked the very first real test of the Manned Maneuvering Unit, or MMU. Basically, it was a jetpack designed for astronauts to float freely during spacewalks. But this wasn't a toy. The MMU was like a miniature spacecraft that wrapped around the astronaut's body. At the time, the International Space Station didn't exist, so there wasn't any particular destination in orbit. But with the MMU, astronauts could glide from the shuttle to satellites or other spacecrafts in the vicinity. The way this thing worked was incredible. It had two joysticks that controlled 24 tiny nitrogen thrusters. One joystick was for rotation, spinning the astronaut in different directions, while the other joystick moved them forward, backward, up, or down. It gave them full control over their motion in microgravity, without any tethers. And on that first MMU test flight, we got one of the most iconic images in space history. Astronaut Bruce McCandless floated high above the Earth, alone, untethered, and completely free. Seeing that image was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. On one hand, it symbolized everything bold and brilliant about human exploration, floating in complete freedom where no one had gone before. On the other hand, Bruce was totally isolated. There was nothing but a thin visor between him and the endless void of the universe. It's one of those images that makes you feel both empowered and very, very small. And while it was beautiful, they weren't up there to take selfies. The mission had a much bigger purpose. Their shuttle also carried two satellites into space, Palapa B2 and Wester 6. Now, these weren't cutting-edge or mysterious satellites. They were standard communication satellites. But they were large, expensive, and incredibly important to the companies that had invested millions to launch them. Normally, releasing satellites from the shuttle was routine, but this time, something went very wrong. The events that unfolded next would shape space operations and insurance policies for years to come. Here's how satellite deployment worked at the time. The shuttle would carry the satellite to a low Earth orbit. Then, to get the satellite into its final orbit, usually much higher up, it would be fitted with a Payload Assist Module, or PAM. Think of the PAM like the upper stage of a rocket. It's a small engine that gives the satellite one last push into its proper position. The idea was to deploy the satellite without needing to move the entire shuttle to that faraway location in space. Both satellites on this mission were destined for geostationary orbit. That's about 22,000 miles above Earth. But the shuttle could only go up to 600 miles high. So the PAM was essential. But shortly after separation, something strange happened. As the PAM ignited and began to fire, the crew noticed the exhaust stream change from a steady plume to a large, uneven puff of gas. It was an ominous sign, and it got worse fast. The engine nozzle had snapped off mid-burn. That meant the PAM failed to produce enough thrust. As a result, both satellites didn't make it to geostationary orbit. Instead, they ended up stranded in a much lower, elliptical orbit. Useless. In space. This wasn't just a setback, it was a massive loss. These satellites cost a fortune, and now they were floating junk in the wrong part of space. And because the shuttle couldn't chase them down and fix the engines, the mission seemed like a total failure. Satellite malfunctions like this are rare. Most launches go off without a hitch. But when they do fail, the consequences are huge, especially back in the 1980s when we didn't have thousands of satellites like we do today. Each one was a big deal. That's why any smart company would take out an insurance policy. Enter Lloyd's of London. This legendary insurance market has existed since 1688 and is known for covering the world's most expensive, dangerous, and downright strange risks. Lloyd's is not your average insurance company. It's more like a collective of super wealthy individuals, called underwriters, who pool their money together to cover risks on massive ventures. We're talking everything from luxury ships to entire skyscrapers. They've insured body parts, rare gems, even Mariah Carey's voice for $35 million. They also paid out over £1 million for the Titanic. And in 1984, they had insured both Palapa B2 and Wester 6. When the satellites failed to reach orbit, Lloyd's had to pay a jaw-dropping $180 million. That was the largest space insurance loss in history at the time. But Lloyd's didn't just write a check and walk away. Once the underwriters paid out the claims, they actually became the legal owners of the satellites. And while those satellites were in the wrong place, they were still physically intact, functioning, just stuck. So now Lloyd's had a wild idea. Instead of writing off the loss, they wondered if there was a way to get the satellites back. Moving them to their intended orbit was out of the question. They were too far off course and would need a brand new PAM engine, something that couldn't be done remotely or easily in orbit. But what if someone could retrieve them, bring them back to Earth? Suddenly, what sounded impossible started to look, maybe doable. NASA got involved, and this idea took shape into one of the most daring space rescue missions ever conceived. And this is where Joseph P. Allen and his crewmates re-enter the story. The idea was to send a shuttle to rendezvous with the stranded satellites and manually bring them back into the payload bay. But there was no robotic arm capable of capturing a satellite mid-orbit. No fancy AI. It would have to be done by hand, literally. Astronauts would fly out using MMUs just like jetpack cowboys in space and wrangle the satellites manually. They would grab the satellites, stabilize them, and guide them back into the shuttle. The plan sounded crazy, but NASA decided to try. And they trained intensely for the mission. When it came time to actually launch, the stakes were enormous. 2 massive satellites, hundreds of millions of dollars, and NASA's reputation were all on the line. Once in orbit, the astronauts approached the satellites. These weren't tiny, smooth objects. They were the size of a compact car and spinning uncontrollably. Joseph Allen, with his MMU, floated out like a scene from a movie. He maneuvered toward the satellite, grabbed it, and held on. It was one of the riskiest, most physically demanding things ever done in space. But slowly, carefully, Joe and his teammates stabilized the satellites. Using a combination of MMU movements and shuttle robotics, they managed to guide both satellites into the cargo bay. It was a jaw-dropping success. Against all odds, the team had rescued 2 stranded machines from orbit. Back on Earth, the satellites were refurbished and later sold back into operation. NASA had pulled off one of the greatest space salvage missions in history, and Joseph Allen became the only astronaut to ever wrestle a satellite in space. Today we don't have the MMU anymore. The technology has been retired. The kind of rescue mission Joseph Allen and his team pulled off? It's simply not something we could repeat with our current tools. But it stands as a powerful reminder of what humanity is capable of when we push our boundaries. In a time when spaceflight was still young and full of daring, NASA proved that even when things go horribly wrong, sometimes, the solution is as bold as reaching out into the void and grabbing the problem, literally, with your own hands. Underwriters could now recover a large portion of the money they had just paid out. All they needed was someone willing and able to go up into space and fetch their stranded satellites. It sounded ridiculous, but this was the 1980s. This was NASA. And the impossible was always just one bold decision away from becoming real. One particular underwriter, Stephen Merritt, understood that better than most. He wasn't just smart, he was strategic. He knew that NASA was eager to showcase the full capabilities of their new space shuttle program. After all, the shuttle orbiter had been sold to the public and the government as a reusable, versatile tool, capable not only of putting things into orbit but also bringing them back down. Merritt also knew that NASA had recently proven the manned maneuvering unit, the astronaut jetpack that allowed free flight in space. And then there was the shuttle's robotic canadarm, a marvel of engineering designed to grapple and maneuver large payloads. These tools weren't just theoretical. They had been specifically built for situations like this: satellite recovery and repair. So Merritt went to NASA with a bold proposal. Lloyd's of London would fully fund the mission. They'd pay NASA $10 million to launch the shuttle, retrieve the 2 satellites, and return them to Earth so they could be refurbished and resold. It wouldn't be a perfect recovery. Lloyd's would still take a loss. But saving even a fraction of the $180 million was better than writing the entire thing off. For the underwriters, it was worth every cent. For NASA, it was a chance to prove that their new shuttle wasn't just another launch vehicle. It was a full-fledged spacefaring machine. And so, preparations began for the most ambitious recovery mission NASA had ever undertaken. Mission specialists Dale Gardner and Joseph P. Allen were assigned to the task. These were no ordinary astronauts. Gardner was precise, analytical, and fearless. Allen brought a unique mix of intellect and grit, an Ivy League physicist with the heart of a wrestler. Both men began training in earnest with the MMU jetpack. They ran through dozens of potential recovery scenarios, simulating every possible angle, failure, and emergency. Meanwhile, engineers were hard at work inventing a new tool just for this mission. They called it the apogee capture device. But the astronauts had a better name for it, the Stinger. It was a long, narrow rod mounted to the front of the MMU. The idea was to fly directly at the satellite, insert the Stinger into the nozzle of one of its maneuvering thrusters, then trigger a mechanism that expanded inside the combustion chamber, gripping it from within. This would give the astronaut a firm lock on the satellite, essentially turning them into a human tow truck in space. Once the satellite was stabilized, they would attach a mechanical clamp to its base. The Canadarm would then grab that clamp, lift the satellite into the shuttle's open payload bay, and secure it for the ride home. It all sounded flawless, on paper. On November 8, 1984, Space Shuttle Discovery launched from Kennedy Space Center on a mission unlike any before. This was NASA's first orbital rescue. The target was Palapa B2, still tumbling in its low, incorrect orbit. Ground controllers had used what little fuel remained in the satellite to reduce its altitude and slow its spin to roughly 1 rotation per minute, just barely manageable. Discovery maneuvered to within a few hundred feet of the satellite, cruising silently at an altitude of 210 miles above Earth. Joe Allen and Dale Gardner suited up. Inside the payload bay, Anna Fisher stood at the controls of the Canadarm, ready for her role in the delicate ballet of space mechanics. For the first attempt, Allen would fly the MMU, while Gardner supported him from the shuttle. As Allen launched from the orbiter, drifting toward the massive Palapa satellite with nothing tethering him to the ship, the sun crept over the horizon, casting brilliant light straight into his helmet. It was blinding. He struggled to see but trusted his training, slowing down, inching forward, guiding the tip of the Stinger into the thruster nozzle. A small puff. A satisfying click. The hooks deployed. He had it. Now he was no longer just flying. He was riding a satellite. Using the MMU thrusters, he canceled the slow spin of Palapa, stabilizing it. This alone would have been historic. But the real challenge was still ahead. As Gardner reached out to attach the custom clamp, the piece designed to give the robotic arm a grip point, he realized something was wrong. It didn't fit. Somewhere in the manufacturing specs, someone had measured the satellite with its antennas extended. But up here, in the vacuum of space, Palapa's antennas had been retracted for launch. The difference was just enough to render the clamp unusable. Without it, the Canadarm couldn't do its job. The robotic arm was suddenly out of the picture. But Gardner and Allen were astronauts. They weren't about to give up. Improvisation was part of the job. What they needed now wasn't more hardware, it was raw human effort. And that's when Joe Allen, a 5 feet 6 inches former high school wrestling champion, decided to do what no one had ever done. He was going to wrestle the satellite into place. Trading his MMU for a rigid foot restraint, Allen locked his boots into position in the payload bay, anchoring himself to the shuttle. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and grabbed Palapa. With both hands, he held the 12,200-pound satellite above his head, like Atlas lifting the heavens. Of course, in zero gravity, the satellite was technically weightless. But that didn't make the job easy. Palapa was still enormous, still dangerous. It could easily drift, collide with the shuttle, or slip from his grasp. Allen couldn't see where his hands were. The body of the satellite blocked his vision. He was working blind, floating in space, delicately balancing a multi-million-dollar object while his teammate bolted on a new mounting plate. The footage of this moment is surreal. A man, motionless, suspended in space, holding a satellite over his head as the Earth rolls silently beneath him. It's one of the most spectacular, underappreciated moments in the history of human spaceflight. After 6 grueling hours outside the shuttle, Allen and Gardner finally returned inside. The first satellite had been recovered. But their mission wasn't over. The very next day they suited up again, this time for the recovery of Wester. The approach went smoothly. Gardner took the lead with the MMU. He inserted the Stinger, stabilized the satellite, and this time the clamp fit perfectly. The Canadarm sprang into action, taking over the lift and gently guiding Wester into the payload bay. The second recovery took half as long as the first. With both satellites secured in the cargo bay, Discovery began its journey home. For the first time in history, a spacecraft had gone up, captured two massive payloads and brought them back down. The mission was a triumph, not just for NASA but for the future of spaceflight. It proved that we could not only explore space but interact with it. Fix it, rescue it, even repossess it if necessary. Now yes, technically the whole operation had been designed to save money for a handful of wealthy insurance underwriters. But what it really demonstrated was that the shuttle was more than a transport vehicle. It was a tool for human ingenuity. A symbol of what was possible when skill, courage, and technology all aligned. And Joseph P. Allen? He became a quiet legend. Not for flying a jetpack. Not for riding a satellite. But for holding one, bare-handed, in the silence of orbit, tethered only by his boots and his will. But just as NASA proved its greatest capability, the entire paradigm shifted. In January 1986, barely a year after this triumphant mission, the Challenger disaster brought everything to a halt. The shuttle program was thrown into crisis. U.S. space policy changed overnight. NASA was no longer allowed to fly commercial payloads. The MMU was retired permanently. Missions like the Palapa and Wester recoveries were shelved, too risky, too dangerous, too expensive. That golden window closed. What Joe Allen and his team accomplished would never be attempted again. And in the decades that followed, no one, not NASA, not SpaceX, not anyone, has sent a human being to recover a satellite in orbit. Which means the image of Joe Allen locked to a spacecraft holding a satellite above his head isn't just historic.